G'day, Nick here, Animal Engineering. Welcome back to the channel. On this episode, we are going to get this chassis frame that I made into the jig on the workbench there that I made a few months ago now. We made that jig up, and now is the time to get this frame into that jig and get all the tabs for all the control arms, the engine mounts, power steering, all the sway bars, get all of that onto this frame. So, pretty exciting. Basically once this stage is done, then it's just shock mounts, and then we can get it under the van and go Ooh. So pretty pumped for this one. So first off, I'm just going to get the subframes out of the jig, and then I'll get this frame up onto the table and probably just spend hours and hours going backwards and forwards, measuring, making sure everything's absolutely perfect, because once it is set up and I use that as my datum, that is it forever. So we'll cut back once I've got the frame on the table in the jig and everything's squared and lined up, and we're ready to start smashing some tabs on. Alright, well, it is the next day, and I spent several hours yesterday, probably a good 4 hours, maybe more, just working through, making sure it's like centered to the jig, everywhere level, perfect as it possibly can be. So it's all looking pretty good. So all the rear section there, ready to go, and the front. So the front there, I think I'm going to start with the front end first. So we'll get all the tabs welded on for the control arms, and then all the threaded inserts for the engine mounts, power steering, sway bar, all that stuff. So it's actually fitting pretty good. You see, so that tab's actually pretty close. It's not far off. It's just going to need a little bit of sanding in a couple of spots, and we'll just slowly bring it in till it's nice and parallel with those bosses. See, I've been through, I didn't film it, I probably should have done a little film on it, but I got all these pieces and I'll put them in some vinegar overnight. So basically I had them in there for about 24 hours just to get all that mill scale off. This mill scale stuff's horrible. Like, you see the difference there. The mill scale is just hard as anything. It's a pain in the ass. It's hard to grind off. So went through, done that. So now it's just a quick clean up on these, and it just makes life a lot easier for welding. So we'll go through. We'll get these tabs on for the control arms first, and then we'll start making up some bosses on the lathe for all the engine mounts and everything like that. Alright, well, that is the first control arm mounted to the chassis frame. It only took 18 minutes. Pretty good. Just needed a little bit of sanding, a little bit of fettling, but not a great deal, which is probably a pretty good sign. So when I done it on the computer, obviously I designed this main frame, and then I done all these tabs as like just big rectangles that went into the frame, and then I done it's called like split body infusion. So I split these bodies with this body, which gave me that cutout, which should match this. So it's a good sign that we are pretty close to what's on the computer. But you see, I welded on the inside there. That's just because it's just easier to get to before welding this that top plate on there. Might as well try and make things as easy as you can. So I'll go through now and I'll do the other 3 control arm points on the front, and we'll cut back. I think we'll cut back once I do the engine mounts. They are going to be quite involved. bit of work on the lathe to make some little billets and pieces up, but that is a good sign. Pretty happy that went so smoothly. Probably jinxing myself a bit, but we'll keep cracking. The other ones seem about the same, so should be okay. Rightio, well that's only taken probably about an hour and a half. They actually all went on pretty good really. So you can see they're all looking pretty good. So I think now I'm going to turn my attention to the power steering support. Now I don't know if you can really sort of see there's a bit of a gap under the jig there. So I've got a bit of a plan for this one. I think what I'm going to do here is, so that obviously has to sit flat on something. So I've got a couple of blocks here. So I'll cut that shape out, we'll drill a couple of holes, and then I'll get some round bar to weld to the back with threads in it, and then we'll cut the frame and get this welded in there. Alright, well what I've come up with is this scenario. So basically that's like a 1/2 inch thick bit of plate. So I'm going to put that on the top there. I'll scribe around that and then I'll cut a hole through the top of the frame. And then got these threaded bits. So I'll weld them onto the bottom and then I'll completely weld this into the frame. So for whatever reason the steering rack has these different sort of headed bolts, and looking at the original subframe it's pretty much, you can sort of see there the discoloration, like how much thread engagement there is. It's quite a lot. So I've got that threaded the whole way, so it's basically a whole bolt worth of thread. So I think that should be plenty strong enough, and that being that 1/2 inch, I can bolt it back up to the jig and then weld right around the top, and that'll give it a nice flat spot to fix onto. So we'll get stuck in, we'll cut a hole and weld this all up. Well, that is the steering rack mounted. I've got it bolted in there. It's fitting really nice. So, see, I've sort of started to polish them up a little bit. Once I get it off the table, I'll do some more blending just so it looks like a nice little blister coming up out of the frame instead of a hard edged piece. Also went through and I've welded what I can on all the tabs. Once it's off the frame, off the jig, I'll be able to get to the inside once these fake army bits are out of the way. So I think now I'm going to turn my attention to the engine mounts. We'll get them done. So the engine mount's basically going to go the whole way through the frame. So I need to make something that this can go through and then a nut can come and stop on, and then go the whole way through the frame so I can get a socket on it from underneath. So what I've come up with is I've got some 1 inch round bar, which you can see it's about the same size as the nut and washer and the socket. So my plan is I've got some 1 3/4 round bar. So I'm going to drill and ream and drill a 13mm hole through this, so a 1/2 inch hole basically through this one for the engine mount to go through, and then the nut will clamp on the bottom of this, and then I'll ream this out to 1 inch so I can push this down inside it, and then that will allow us to get the socket up through from the bottom, and I think this should work okay. So I'll go over to the old lathe and I'll drill that out to 1/2 inch, ream that out to 1 inch, press them together, and then we'll get it welded on. Alright, well that took a hell of a lot longer than I was expecting it to, but I have my pieces made up. So basically, got one inside the other, got a nice bevel on both, so I'll put a bit of a weld around there with the TIG, sort of allowing enough room to get the socket in there, with a little bit of play. So that should work really good. Now I've got to transfer the hole from the top of the chassis through to the bottom. So to try and keep myself square, I also cut this little piece. So I'll tack that onto the top of the chassis rail, and I'll use that as a guide to drill down through the bottom, which hopefully that should get us nice and square down to the bottom, and then I'm just going to punch a bigger hole in the bottom for that, and then we can weld her in. There we go, well, there you have it, that's all welded up, my little sleeve adaptery bit. So goes on there nice and good on the thread there. Get the nut. Whoop. You see the socket. Fits in there nice and good. And that's all in there and working really nice actually. So now we'll just get that other bit tacked on the frame, drill through, and then ream a massive hole through for this, and then we can weld it in. Alright, well there you go, that's them welded in. You see the socket fits in nice and good, just goes up there. Beautiful. Just enough room to do her up. Which is good. So now I just do a couple of plug welds on the top. Now when I drew it up on the computer, it was based off the scan, and you can see right. There's 2 holes beside the main hole there. Now I can't work out what they are for. Basically, engine mount's got that little dicky bit there, which sort of locates on the front hole. So basically what I've done is I've drilled them out, and I'm going to use them to plug weld that piece I just put in to help locate it on the top. There, just burn those 4 plugs in, and then that'll be the engine mounts done. We can put an engine in this thing, which is pretty exciting. So I'll quickly bash that out, and then we'll move on to the sway bar, which should be pretty straightforward. This should be the easiest bit, I think. So yeah, I'll plug weld them up, and then we'll have a look at the sway bar situation. Alrighty, well I've got the jig back on there now, and where the sway bar goes is a 8.5mm hole. I believe it's an M8 bolt, or they had studs there. I'm going to use bolts, drill and tap for bolts. So basically I'm just going to get this, drill through those holes just a little bit to get a centre mark, like transfer the hole, and then we'll get the jig off. And then my plan is to drill and tap a hole, and then get some little bits of 1/2 inch round bar, drill and tap them, screw them in, mark around them, ream a 1/2mm hole, put the round bar in, weld her up. Should work pretty good and be fairly fast and efficient. So quickly go through and mark them up. Alright, well it is the next morning. I finished up yesterday, made these little billets up to go in the front for the front sway bar. I also had a bit of a clean up. Things were getting a bit out of control. One downside to only having one workbench is when you're doing a project like this, it takes up the whole workbench. Things get a bit messy. So what I done was I got some blue die-chem. Put some blue die-chem on there. Shred these in. And then I've gone through with the scriber. You can see there the blue die-chem, scribed a line. So been there, scribed a line. Now what I'm using is, I've got these impact reamers. So I've got these for doing all the riveting stuff. Basically, when you do all your marking, laying out, if you need, say, like a 7/8 hole, like if you're using a 7/8 rivet, it's 22.4 mil, I think it is. So you drill a 20 mil hole, and then if you have any misalignment, you go through with these impact reamers. Just goes on a rattle gun. So I'll go through and ream these out to 7/8, and basically I'll scribe that line there just in case I go on the piss. I can keep an eye and make sure I'm going the right way. If I go off a little bit, I can just finish it off with the die grinder. So we'll ream these out. Right, well that's all welded in and cleaned up. Now the impact reamer was a little bit of a fail. I'm glad I put that die-chem in and marked the hole. It wasn't really an issue with the reamer, more my just being silly. So the reamer was actually too long and it started hitting the bottom of the frame, which made it chatter around. But luckily I had that scribe line so I could stop, and I finished off with the die grinder. But now I have the sway bar. I'm trying to go through photos to see which way around this goes. I can't really remember, to be honest. But we should be able to get this on, and then the power steering rack as well, and then that will be the front done. So we'll chuck it all on and have a look. Alright, well, there you have it. That's we've got the front control arm mounts done, the engine mounts done, the steering rack done, sway bar mounted. So that's a pretty decent step forward. We'll have a bit of a look. Engine mounts are in nice and solid, looking good. Steering rack. This little bracket here's ended up pretty good. It's sort of landing right on the top on that flat spot there, so we'll drill and tap a hole right there for that one. And then these other mounts, once we get the engine in and we get this all hooked up, we can go back and do that. There, pretty stoked with that. It's only been a few days and that's most of the front squared away. I do still need to suss out what I'm doing with the shock tower supports. My original plan was to build them into the actual body of the van, but for maintenance reasons and that, I want to be able to just lift the van off and push the chassis out with everything connected. So I think once I've got the motor in and the radiator in, I'm going to have to build a mount for the radiator, and then we'll try and work some shock mounts into that whole situation, I feel. So I think we'll leave it there for this episode. So yeah, as always, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Share the video with your mates. Click subscribe. We'll see you on the next one.